You know, when I was little, a whole lot littler, a whole lot younger, and still had a fertile imagination, I loved masks. Plastic masks, wooden masks, paper masks, homemade or purchased, simple or intricate, it didn't matter. I loved masks. With each different mask, I could become a different person. With different masks, I could become whoever I needed to become. I could catch the bad guys. I could leap over tall buildings. I could swing on vines in the forest canopy.
This is the story of Stanley Ipkiss.
Stanley, you are the nicest guy. Really, you are.
Yeah. His job is at the bank.
You're 40 minutes late. Now that's the same as stealing.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dickey. It'll never happen again.
He loves his dog.
Come on, give him to me. Drop it.
He's polite to his landlord.
Ipkiss, do you have any idea what time it is?
You know, Mrs. Penman,
What? Nothing.
And the most exciting thing in his life are his pajamas. But now,
Hey, you! What are you doing down there? I'm just looking for my mask!
all that is about to change. Because Stanley Ipkiss is not the man he used to be.
Smoking! It's like it brings your innermost desires to life.
And like the movie The Mask, with Jim Carrey, like it suggests, when I was behind the mask, I could hide my insecurity. I could disguise my weakness. You see, I could be who I really wasn't, or so I thought. I could do what I really couldn't, or so I thought. So, are we wearing any masks today? Paul was a follower of the holy man Jesus. His reflections on the experience of God as expressed through Jesus have been the basis for much of what people understand as Christianity. Some of his writings have been used over the millennia to spiritually set people free, and some of the writings have been misused to disenfranchise people. Let's be honest about it. Whatever your understanding of Paul and the way Christianity has been used or abused through the writings of Paul, he knew about the way people wore masks to hide their true selves. He was writing to the church at Thessalonica, reminding them that what he had shared with them and with the rest of the world was as real as it got. And he couldn't, he just wouldn't hide behind a mask when he shared his understanding of God. And he learned that from the teachings of Jesus. Right after Jesus told a story about a young man who'd finally decided to take off his mask and return home, the prodigal son. Right after Jesus told a story about faithfulness and honesty, the Pharisees laughed. It wasn't the laughter of joy at a new truth learned or the laughter one shares with colleagues. It was the laughter of derision. The laughter of those who were themselves hiding behind masks. And Jesus said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among humankind is often detestable in God's sight." The Pharisees were often the foils in the encounters with Jesus. They came off as unwelcoming, stuck in traditions that excluded all but the most pious. The Pharisees were portrayed as holier than thou, as hiding behind masks of hypocrisy. But of course, to focus on their foibles means that I might still be peering out from the safety of my own mask. Anybody ready to take off your mask today? Let's explore God's understanding of who we are, at least as expressed in scriptures and through the prophets. Let's explore God's understanding, not the world's understanding, not the way the world sees us. Let's pull off the masks and get honest with who we are. In all reality, God already knows even the deepest secrets, fears, and insecurities of our hearts. So it seems to me that we can be honest with ourselves and others, at least here in this sanctuary, this safe place, this holy ground, where God is supposed to be, if nowhere else, right? As the psalmist wrote, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." Before masks even existed, we find stories in Genesis, a story that we were created in God's image, and yet we begin to hide from that image right away. We begin to hide our nakedness behind the artist's conception of a mask for the body, a fig leaf. The stories of hiding behind masks continue throughout our faith history. Cain in his anger, Esau as he steals a blessing, David as he seeks another person's wife, Moses when he tells God that he can't lead the people of Israel, Elijah as he hides in a cave, the Samaritan woman at the well who failed to look at her own relationships, the bleeding woman who tried to hide in the crowd, Peter who denied he knew Jesus, Paul who did the things he didn't want to do. Here's the thing. God knew all about their failures. God knew their weaknesses. And God knew the hypocrisy of each person I just mentioned. But God continued to work through them, to love them. This also means, I think, that the Holy One knows the failures, the weaknesses, and the hypocrisy we each live with, and will continue to work through us and love us. God sees behind the superficial masks that we show to the world and looks right through them to the real person, looks right through them to your heart. And yet God still loves and accepts each and every one of us. How do I know that? Well, because as Paul suggests, the masks come off when you allow God to work through you. And the truth of God's love then comes out, regardless of how the world would want to stop that truth. I know it because I see it. And I'm not alone in that understanding of God. The Apostle John writes, "This then is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in God's presence whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts and knows everything." Paul also wrote, "In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express." I would suggest that we don't need to hide behind masks. We don't need to hide our true selves, because God gives us the heart and the strength to be ourselves and to share the image in which we were created, the image of sacredness in which we were created, that holy image. In fact, some of what Jesus taught, some of what Jesus told us through his life and his words, by sharing them with the Pharisees, was take off your masks. Paul called us through his word to the church at Thessalonica to take off our masks. And I would suggest all that is holy, all that is truly holy, calls us to take off our masks, to share our sacred essence with each other. It can be a risk. But God knows our hearts and wants us to take off our masks, to be honest with ourselves and others as we live through and out of and in our faith, wherever you might be in that journey. One of the very basics of being spiritually healthy, I think, being in healthy relationships, is to be honest with who we are and whose we are. That means removing our masks intended to hide our true selves. That means removing masks that cause us to be less than authentic. That means letting the world see the real person, the person that God delights in. So, you've been given a paper mask. During our experience of communion together, I invite you to write on that mask, the front or the back, or any way you want, any of the ways that you see yourself hiding your true self from others. What are those ways in life that you've hidden behind a mask? Perhaps you present yourself to the world as not needing anyone else. Perhaps you make sure you're seeing the rest of the world as a victim. Perhaps it could be that you exhibit a pious side all of the time, rather than allowing your faith doubts to be shared. Whatever you write down, I invite you to offer it up to God as you take the bread and the juice this morning. And then take the mask home with you. And every so often reread what you have written, reminding yourself that God is delighted in the real you, not the mask. Unmask yourself and celebrate the holiness that is you. Just a thought this morning. Bye.